Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. In this video, we're going to start a new series about helping to demystify and understand Azure costs. And we're going to take a look at some of the different resource types. We're going to start off with logic app consumption, and we're going to go through some of the different things that I would be thinking about when I'm building a solution in terms of cost. We're going to try and understand where some of your costs would go and what kind of optimizations you can look at. So we'll work our way through this table, and we'll just tick off things as we go. So we're going to start off with the one here for what actually makes up the cost of a logic app. So we need to think about what is it that makes up a logic app's cost itself. So here we've got a little table, and sometimes we think, well, the primary parameters, the number of runs and the number of actions. But actually, if you look into the metadata in terms of logic app costs, you'll see there's a couple of different meters available. So here, for example, are the key ones. So we've got built-in actions, which are things like the parse JSON shape, the compose shape, and other kind of built-in ones. We have standard connector actions. So this would be where I call out to an API connection and I connect to another system. Now, the key thing to note is, in addition to the standard ones, there's also enterprise connectors. Now, the logic app I'm looking at here doesn't have an enterprise connector. It only uses standard ones. But if there were enterprise, you would see another meter showing up here. And then the other one to remember is we also have data retention. So this is going to be things like your run history and storage behind the scenes. Now, if we look at the graph, in this particular logic app, you can see the biggest cost for this logic app is really the built-in actions. So this will be things like the HTTP action, for example. And this is probably really things that run on the logic app compute node itself. Now, you can see, I think in this one, if I remember right, we use the SQL connector quite a bit. So that's probably going to be the bulk of the standard connector actions. And then you can see we've got the tiny little cost for data retention. So this logic app gets a moderate number of runs, but not a huge amount. But there'll be a small amount of data retention for those run histories for the period of time that would be kept. So I'd expect if you have a longer retention, or you get more runs, that storage cost's probably going to be bigger. So this is really what you'd see in a logic app under the hood once you go looking beyond the billing item of just my cost per logic app. Now, what also is really interesting with logic apps is on your bill, you're going to see a cost for logic apps, and you see in the main billing data, you would see the individual line item for the logic app. Now, one of the differences to note, which I think I might do a separate video about, is that the cost for the connectors here for logic app consumption gets rolled into the cost for the logic app itself, whereas in logic app standard you would see those as a separate item. So we'll maybe look at that in a future video. Okay, so let's go back to the table here. We've understood now what is it that makes up the cost for a logic app, and when I'm thinking about the logic app I'm going to build, and I need to think about the billing parameters. So the primary ones we're looking at are the number of runs and the number of actions. The more runs I have per day, the more messages I process, the higher the cost. And if my logic app has more shapes in it and more actions and connectors, that'll increase the cost as well. Now, one of my design considerations next on the list is going to be, if I'm going to build a logic app consumption logic app, might I be better choosing something else? This would be a key design point. And there's more than just cost would factor into this decision. But if we think about the cost considerations, we typically would expect that a function app is going to usually be cheaper than a logic app, because in a logic app, I'm going to be paying for all of the individual connection points. Whereas the function app itself, you don't really have the persistence usually, and because your code executes in line, you haven't really got those action type cost models. So, if I'm comparing like for like with a function app on kind of consumption functions versus a consumption logic app, The function's probably going to be cheaper, but I'm going to trade off a lot of features like the designer, and I'm going to have to code a lot more stuff myself. Now, if I compare Logic App Standard with Logic App Consumption, there's going to be scenarios where Logic App Consumption would be better for value for money, and there'll be other scenarios where Logic App Standard would be better value for money. So there's never really just a one size fits all answer here. It depends on a lot of things, and I think one of the key things to think about is don't think about it in terms of just one individual Logic app. Think of all the different ones that you're running. So the more, if you're doing Logic App Standard, which again we'll talk about in more detail in a future video, the more workflows that you can run on an individual node on a plan, the lower the cost comes down per workflow. Whereas consumption is very much pay as you go, and it's going to be there's going to be a very one-to-one type relationship between the amount of runs you have and how much it's going to cost. Next up, if we think about efficiency and complexity, so this really comes back to this this measure up here. So we've got that parameter that says the more runs and the more actions I have, the more it's going to cost me. So really what I want to try and do is keep my Logic app fairly simple and make sure it's efficient. Now, there's a trade-off there because quite often you want to put shapes in to, so you might break things up and have multiple shapes to achieve a certain requirement rather than having one complex shape. So I think a good example of that might be if I have like a loop or something like that, I might break it into a separate workflow, or I might do things like have multiple parse JSONs so I can get different parts of my message. And things like inline code, for example, you might have break things up and have multiple inline code blocks. And the trade-off is that you have more actions, which means you would pay more cost, but then the supportability of your workflow probably becomes that bit easier. So there's a real a bit of an art there to finding the right balance, so you make your Logic app supportable, easy to change, and you might pay just a little bit more for that. But then there's other scenarios where I've seen workflows where there's massive nested if statements and all that kind of thing, where you could maybe do some of those things in a different way. So a good example might be, can I call a liquid map and execute some logic in there to transform some data that might get rid of lots of conditions that mean more shapes and more complexity. Okay, now next up we're going to look at an example of these three together. I think I've got quite a good example. I hope that'll kind of give a bit of flavour of what these look like. So the decision here really is about when we're using connectors, we've got things like an HTTP connector, cloud connector, and an API management connector. So we think about the choice here, right? If I'm building a Logic app and I'm calling out to an external system, let's just for argument's say I'm going to call out to an API and a third party. I can choose between things like HTTP connector, API management as a proxy, or I could use maybe a cloud connector if they've already got one. So each of those things has a very subtle difference in how I would implement the Logic app and what the net cost would be as a result of that. So I'm going to show an example of some of the cost differences using an example from SAP here. So choosing which connectors to use, because the cost for particularly cloud connectors, enterprise connectors, and HTTP would be slightly different. And then I think there's also a question about data gateways. Now, some connectors like the SAP connector would bring in a requirement for a data gateway, so then I'd suddenly have to have a VM as part of my architecture. And that would mean that probably I need 2 instances of a VM, so I've got some HA kind of capability in there. Suddenly I've got the cost of another resource to support my Logic app. So there might be a question, well, if that data gateway is not used by anything else, suddenly my cost goes up considerably. But if I can use that data gateway for other integrations I'm going to build, so I've got 20 or 30 Logic apps all share the data gateway, the cost of ownership of that gateway comes down considerably because I'm reusing it for other value. Okay, so let's have a look at a little cost example here to dig into this question a bit further. So on the screen here, I've got 3 scenarios, and I'm just going to talk through these. So imagine we've got a scenario where, sorry, let me get my whiteboard for a second. Okay, so let's imagine we've got a scenario here where we've got 5,000 runs a day for a logic app, and we've got 3 different scenarios. So scenario 1, the logic app, and in each of them the logic app has 50 actions to be able to process the entire message. And let's pretend the message comes in, we do some stuff, manipulate the data, and then we have to make 3 calls to SAP to be able to process that message. So maybe we do 2 lookups and then we do an insert or something like that. So the 3 ways we could implement this are: we use the SAP connector for those calls to SAP. We could do a scenario where we might use API management, or we could do a scenario where we use HTTP. Sorry, let me just change this one slightly. It's a slight bug in my sheet there. So in the scenario, we're making 3 calls to SAP, and I think I put a scenario where I also had a standard connector call, so maybe we're calling SQL. Now, there's 3 ways I can do this. So the SAP connector is pretty straightforward. Everybody's doing that already. So you call an object on SAP. You've got to go through the gateway to get that. So that means you have to have that on-prem data gateway scenario. So here I've got some costs for the data gateway. So we're going to assume that you need 2 servers, and you're going to be talking a ballpark in the region of about 500 a month for those servers. Now, I'm going to keep this as pay as you go just to keep it simple, but you could potentially get some discounts for reservations on those. The second scenario is we're going to have the SAP team of exposed web services that we can call, and we're going to proxy them with API management. So here I've got my API management now. I think we can use the standard V2 tier, which will give us network connectivity. So that's going to be one of the big things here, is how do you get the network connectivity? So in this case, we can VNet connect our API management, and then we can go through that into SAP. Now, the third scenario is we're going to use the HTTP connector. Now, here this may not work too well with SAP because you're probably not going to be able to hit the endpoint unless you go through the network. So I'm going to make the assumption that in this case the endpoint is publicly available, so I can hit it from consumption logic apps if I've got the right security. So this one may depend a bit. But let's have a look at the different scenarios here. So with the logic app, in each case we've got 50 actions, but on the SAP connector, the big difference is we've got 3 SAP connector calls. That's the enterprise connector. With the API management one, those calls will either be a standard connector or they'll count as a normal action. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but for the point of this, it doesn't really matter too much. The key thing is that we've got rid of these enterprise connectors. We've still got our SQL connector in every scenario here. And then the third one, the standard HTTP one, would just run straight off the workflow nodes. There's no call out to any other connector or anything, and that would only have really 3 connector calls. Now, if we have 5,000 runs, let's start by looking at the costs for one run. So the standard calls here, the standard connector calls, really the one that's a bit different is this APIM one. I'm assuming we're going to have 6 calls instead of 3. The one with the SAP connectors, obviously one run's going to cost $0.003 dollars because we've got a couple of connector calls in there. So the total run, you can see there's a bit of a difference here between the one-off individual, and it's obviously not a huge difference. Just if you do it only one message a day, you're probably not really going to notice it. But if we have 5,000 messages a day, this starts to become a much bigger difference. You can see here using the SAP connector, if we're only looking at just the Logic app cost, with the SAP connector, we're starting to get in the region of $20–25 a day, whereas the APIM connector and the HTTP connector would be significantly lower. So we roll that up across a month, and you can see suddenly there's like $300 difference, $350 difference per month between those different options. Now, next we need to think about what does this mean in terms of if we have the other resources, because this is obviously a one-off. This is obviously a one-off interface. There might be other interfaces going on as well. So we need to think about, well, let's bring in the cost for things like the API management and the and things like the data gateway service. So I'm just going to correct this bit here. So in the SAP connector, we said we had our HA data gateway service. That's going to be in the region of $500 a month. Now our standard API management was $700 a month. Now, obviously the API management's a bit more expensive, but because the costs were so much lower without having that SAP connector, you can see in this case it's actually, you're talking in the region of about $200 a month cheaper just for this one Logic app to be able to use API management instead of the SAP connector. So that's really worth considering getting your SAP team to expose web services for that. Again, the HTTP connector is even cheaper because we don't have the API management involved. But there might be a couple of blockers there. I said earlier that the HTTP connector potentially is going to get constrained by not having network connectivity. But also that API management resource can be used by a lot more scenarios than just this one Logic app. So you can use it for other scenarios like other integrations, or you can have non-Logic app based integrations using API management. So suddenly that, while we assume API management's quite a premium feature, in this scenario where we had one Logic app with 5,000 runs a day of moderate complexity, the cost model stacked up really well to use API management instead of using the SAP connector. And really, in this case, the more runs we have per day, the more this return on investment for API management would come into play. So I found that was really quite interesting when I started kind of looking into that. So for me, if we come back over here, there's really a question about, with the enterprise connectors, they make it a lot simpler, but there's a cost trade-off for that. So you really need to think about how much you're using those connectors. And for me, if we think about some of the different connectors that are available, if you've got some of the kind of mainframe type integration scenarios, they probably add a load of value, but some of the other ones, you might be better off thinking about API management as a better option in terms of cost and flexibility. So I hope that we've covered most of these three here. I think that's quite an interesting subtopic. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is Loggin. So we're looking at the optimizations now over here. So what can I do to optimize the costs of my Logic app consumption? So the first one is Loggin. Now, if you turn on the diagnostic settings for Logic apps, you're going to start streaming logs to something. So the most common thing people tend to use would be a log analytics workspace. And what's going to happen is you're now going to start getting a cost for that log analytics workspace in addition to your Logic app. So you're going to get things like metrics, and you're going to get events for Logic apps starting and finishing, and for actions starting and finishing. So quite quickly you're going to build up a lot of logs. If we take the scenario, we were just looking at 5,000 runs a day with 50 actions. So you're going to get a start and stop shape for every action. Sorry, a start and stop log event for every action. So if there's 50 of them, then that's 100 events, 5,000 messages a day. Suddenly we're getting, so what, 50,000, 100,000 events for that logic app. So that's quite a lot of logging just for one workflow for one day. So that's going to really ramp up quite quickly. So we need to think about, do we really need logging? And if we do, how do we minimize with things like optimizing our log analytics workspace to control how long we store the logs for and what type of logging we're using? Now, the next optimization that really comes into play is minimizing unnecessary shapes. So this will definitely help with your login if you need to turn that on and get those. You're going to accept a cost for login because you need it for supportability. But the fewer shapes that have no value that you can do, the lower the number of log events are going to be. So that could really help you there. I think another really great optimization is looking at the effective use of API management and functions. So I think something people often do is they try to do every single thing in a workflow, and then the workflow becomes huge and unmanageable. And I think if you've got a really good integration team, doing things like making a call out to a function and putting a little bit of C# code in that function can take a lot of complexity out of your logic app. So a good example might be if I need to go and loop through every record I've received in a batch and get rid of all of the ones that have the status deferred. So if I've got 10,000 rows in my logic app, I would have to do a loop, and then I may have to, execute one iteration of that loop is going to be 10,000 actions. But then if I need to do 3 or 4 things, suddenly I've got 3 or 4 actions times 10,000, and suddenly my number of actions has gone up considerably in that run, and that's going to directly translate into a cost increase. So if I can make a call out from the workflow to a function where I can use a bit of C#, where I just loop over the JSON, get rid of all the deferred records, and then return the JSON. So like a filtering of the data, doing that in a function is going to be hugely cheaper than doing it in the logic app. The next thing we're thinking about is triggers. So here we've got things like recurrence triggers and polling triggers. So recurrence triggers are going to run on a period of time. So let's say we have a trigger running every day. So let's say the logic app triggers, it runs, we go and do something and then do it again the next day. That's going to be fine. If we start increasing the frequency of the trigger, then we're going to have a higher cost. So let's say my logic app runs once a day, it goes and does 10 actions. If I do it twice a day, the cost's going to double. 4 times a day, it's going to go up by 4 times. So thinking about how often we want to run our integrations and also how big they are, because if they're small, you probably wouldn't care that much. But if they're going to do a huge amount of work, then you need to really think about what's the minimum recurrence I can have. And it's probably better to start small and grow than it is to start with a high recurrence frequency and come back. So I think that's a good one, and especially I think in different environments as well. In production, you might want to run the job every 10 minutes, but in test, you might just do it every hour or every couple of hours because people aren't looking for the immediate availability of data. Polling triggers are another good one. So a couple of examples would be things like service bus trigger is a really great one. So we connect that trigger, and then every 30 seconds, it's going and checking if there's a message available, processing it, and then it'll keep that connection open for 30 seconds. And if any messages come in, it'll process them, and then it'll go and connect again. So what's going to happen there is my logic app could be sitting just constantly polling every 30 seconds for messages. And if it's something like a test environment, I might not actually process any data at all. So that's going to incur a significant amount of cost if I add up all of my different logic apps across every day. We had a company we worked with where we were saving $1,000 a month by turning off logic apps in the non-prod environments when they're not used, because you want that aggressive polling to fire data as soon as when you want your logic app to be executed, so during UAT or in production. But if you're not testing very often, you can maybe back off that polling so it's not as frequent. And that kind of comes on to my next point here, which is about workload optimization. So if you can do some kind of automation to enable or disable any of your logic apps so that they're not running when you don't really need them, especially if they've got polling or recurring triggers, there's just ways to tune the costs. So even things like if we have our logging on for our triggers, all those polling triggers are going to create log events as well, and it just creeps your cost up when you're not really doing anything. So that kind of optimization is going to really help you as well. Okay, so I think that was my more detailed brain dump about logic app costs, consumption costs. This was part of the session I did at the Nordic Integration Summit recently, so hopefully that gives people a bit more of a deep dive on that topic area. But I'd love to hear feedback on what people think, and if we have any questions I've not covered. Have a great week.